Could I remind you that the debate will finish at 11:20 today, because then I will be going to welcome the President of Angola. And you can enroll according to the usual system, using your card and pressing the appropriate button.
The floor.
Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący.
President Tajani, Minister
Stadler, Szanowny Panie Przewodniczący.
Karolina Stadler, who was supposed to be here, Mr. Dombrovskis, members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me, as the Prime Minister of the Polish government, to have the opportunity to speak to you here in Strasbourg and to give you the Polish point of view on the challenges that face the European Parliament. It's also an honor to speak to the European Parliament. Amongst all of the EU institutions, it is the Parliament that reflects the voice of its citizens expressed in universal elections. The European Parliament is an important part of the EU's functioning, not just because it has an enormous influence on the shape of European legislation, but also because it's a forum in which discussions take place that set the course for the European Union for the next few years. Poland is celebrating the 550th anniversary of its first parliament and the 100th anniversary of its independence. We were one of the first countries to give full democratic rights to women as well. And this shows how Poland has deep roots in parliamentarism and the rule of law. National parliaments are the voice of the sovereign and the lifeblood of democracy. The discussion on the future of Europe is one of the most important debates that we can have, particularly on this, the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, which began the very difficult history of the 20th century in Europe. The cataclysms of 2 world wars and the genocidal crimes saw the free countries begin with a historic project 60 years ago, aiming to find what could bring us together. If it hadn't been for the Iron Curtain and the tragic division of Europe, Poland would also have been one of the founding fathers of the European community. That's what the Polish government in exile had wanted at the time. Polish society was therefore kept outside of the first stage in European integration and sustainable development. So now, as a fully fledged member of the EU, we want to do our bit to aim to create a constructive programme for the future of our continent. We have our expectations, as every country in the European Union does, but we also have plenty to offer. You can't understand the continuity of Europe without understanding its Greek, Roman and Judeo-Christian roots. Without those, we would never have achieved what we have achieved today, this feeling of universalism, for example, that you can see here, the diversity that we cherish. Now, these slogans are not just empty words in Europe. Our continent has been shaped by its culture and institutions over hundreds of years, and respecting national identities is part of the trust that must be built in the EU. Constitutional pluralism in Article 4 of the treaty is one of the great values of the EU, and every country has a right to set up its legal system in line with its own traditions. The idea of Europe, for me, was always a reason of state. As a young man, I was part of the anti-communist opposition fighting for freedom and democracy. But the same went for my work in the European Integration Committee, working on Poland's accession to the EU in the 90s. 30 years since the fall of communism, we're still part of a difficult process of sewing together the different parts of Europeans' history and memory. But we mustn't lose sight of the joint goal, which is the safety and security of our citizens and economic development. Members of the House, in the last few years, the European Union has been dealing with a number of existential crises: the financial crisis, the banking crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, or Russian aggression. 5 no's in referendums and a change in the political landscape in member states. All of these things go to show that the European project needs a new openness. Some have said that the European Union always go through crises, and all changes to the treaties arise from those crises and reinforce it. However, the situation today seems to be without precedent, different to the 70s or the 80s or the first decade of this century. That's because it's not just one crisis, but a accumulation of several crises happening at the same time. And any response to those crises has to be based on a sound understanding of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We know that a lot of Europeans aren't so enthusiastic about integration anymore, and some are outright against. You can be offended by that, you can close your eyes to it, you can say it's just a marginal group, but it's not going to change the reality of the fact that it's not a marginal group. This is a real message that we've made mistakes and that we have to correct those mistakes. Instead of wringing our hands about the threat, we should start thinking about how we got into this situation where many Europeans no longer like the direction that the EU is going in. The answer to that question has been given many times and in many ways, but I think that the best answer is to be found in all of the major changes in our history. People have a freedom gene in their DNA. They want to decide on their future, their children's future, their family's future, their society's future for themselves. And when they see that they're losing that influence and that they don't have any influence on the future of Europe and the world, then they're going to oppose what's happening. I think that we all agree, more or less, that European integration is one of the most significant phenomena in the history of not only Europe, but the world. However, if citizens don't share that view, then no further integration can be possible. Therefore, their voice has to be taken into account. If the European project is to move forward, therefore, its democratic legitimacy has to be reinforced. You can call that populism if you like, but at the end of the day, we're going to have to answer the questions asked by citizens and their expectations. It's all about the very meaning of democracy. Europe is going through a democratic enlightenment. We have to renew the social contract that's been such a success since the Second World War. That contract meant rebuilding a feeling of security, rebuilding the economy, offering prosperity to all. Today, we need a covenant, an annex to that contract, showing that our children will also have a better life than we had. We have to build confidence in the European project. So how do we answer this democratic change? Well, Europe has to be up to the challenges of the modern age without giving up on the duties it already has to its citizens. To deal with all of these challenges, we have to rebalance the relationship between the member states and the EU institutions. The Union of Nations 2.0, according to de Gaulle's vision, is one way of doing this, and that's Poland's proposal. An intelligent adjustment would focus on 3 things. First of all, the Union 4.0 would be the bridgehead of the fourth industrial revolution. The second thing would be a secure European Union, which is aware of the geopolitical challenges that it faces and have a single answer to them, where we would speak with one voice. Next, a union of citizens with solidarity and supporting our citizens against the power of global corporations. Let me just say a little more about those. Yes, we need more cooperation when we face the challenges of the global economy. Europe needs to set ambitious goals, an audacious budget for the single market. The finalization of the single market, the increase in productivity, can only be achieved if competitiveness is increased in a fully integrated single market. According to the European Parliament's own analysis, in the last 14 years, it has contributed to a growth in GDP of 250 billion euro, ceteris paribus. Services, for example, are responsible for 70% of the Union's GDP, but only 25% of trade within the EU. The Services Directive from 2006 needs to be revised so that it can reflect services as they are provided today. There can't be a single market unless we fight the disparities, unless we have an ambitious cohesion policy. This can't be a one-way street for underdeveloped countries. It's about developing the single market, which brings enormous trade benefits to those, including to those who are calling for it to be limited. Our calculations and the Union's own calculations show that 75 cents in every euro go back to netto payers in the form of orders and business. Commissioner Oettinger quoted that figure recently. So let's be very clear. Limiting cohesion policy is populism. Doesn't matter whether you call it pro or anti-European populism. Cohesion policy and an ambitious fight with disparities in the Union is a win-win strategy, something that's good for all our members. Fighting inequality is something that can be done through transfers in the cohesion policy, yes, but also by bolstering our tax system, closing loopholes in the VAT system and clamping down on tax havens in the EU. VAT income revenue is, after all, EU own resources. The Commission has said that tax avoidance and evasion is worth 200 billion euro a year, and if you include VAT, it's 150 billion more than that. That is the big elephant in the room, and if it isn't, then I don't know what is. In Poland, we've managed to do this. We have dealt with VAT fraudsters who are stealing VAT from our citizens, including lawyers' offices who were avoiding paying their taxes for years and who were getting around a weak legal system. Indeed, the judiciary was particularly passive in the face of these fraudsters. They often had very low penalties, sometimes suspended penalties, and we heard that it had to be like that. There was no way of challenging it. But we've shown that you can do something about this. We've done something positive for Polish and European tax revenue. We have to set out what our goal is and then put in place measures that will help us achieve it. And that's what we're offering Europe. A practical solution that has already been tried and tested. We've talked about this in the Council on a number of occasions. Mafia, terrorists and crooks stealing from member states whose judiciaries don't work properly is something that we've shown you can fight against. We've also managed to pretty much eradicate poverty in young people and children. That's another of our contributions. Within the EU, we also have to cooperate in order to challenge tax avoidance, like the digital tax and tax havens. I was talking with President Tajani this morning, and I talked about EU own resources. Poland supports the idea that I know most of the European Parliament supports, that is, that the EU should have sufficient own resources. It's essentially, therefore, to restrict tax havens, not just individual countries, but their existence undermines the EU's existence because billions are leaking out of our tax systems and that money doesn't come back to citizens as a result. We chase tax fraudsters or tax evaders at an individual level, and we should therefore also be chasing up on systematic or even state tax havens and tax avoiders. It seems logical to me that we should have also a European anti-monopoly office for dealing with competition issues. We need new competition rules, perhaps also sectoral rules adapted to the digital age. Google and Facebook could be described as part of essential facilities or critical infrastructure now. The same as distribution infrastructure in the energy market. None of us, none of the people in this room could imagine life without these instruments. They're essential for functioning in the digital age, and our legislative framework has to catch up with that reality. A new investment plan has been put forward by President Juncker, and it has been a success. Growth is up, and the European Strategic Investment Fund has also generated further investments in the amount of 300 billion euro. We shouldn't limit ourselves to that, but we should also transform it into a further ambitious tool. We need strategic investment, not just because we're coming out of a crisis, but so that we can be competitive in the future. The European Investment Bank has warned that the European Union is suffering from a chronic lack of investment in infrastructure, where expenditure is lower than it has been in many years. The investment hole or the investment gap is 600 billion euro, and until that hole is filled, we're not going to be able to compete with other global powers. Another strategic goal is the European energy transformation, which means linking competitiveness on price with geopolitical realism. What does that mean? What do we need? We must invest in innovation. Europe needs to create the biggest clean tech fund in the world and make sure that the energy transition becomes a rational proposition for businesses around Europe. These things are going to be essential if we're going to be competitive in the future. The European route to a low-carbon economy, or even a zero-emissions economy, is certainly a worthy goal, a road to a clean environment and healthy citizens. Perhaps in Poland we are aware of the importance of this, and that's why we've introduced measures to clean up our air and fight against smog. However, with the new limitations that the EU has imposed, I call on you to remember that our countries have started from a different place. In 1989, Poland's economy was based on coal and heavy industry. All the same, Poland made great efforts to meet the emissions set out in the Kyoto Protocol of 30%, and we, even though our target had originally only been 5%, so we were 6 times better than that. We want to participate in the energy transformation. However, it has to be based on equality of opportunity and take into account the differences between our economies. It also needs to offer different instruments to support the different member states. For many years, Poland didn't have the opportunity to change to natural gas because it only came from one direction, from Russia. Any attempt to use blue energy sources would have been a risk to our national security. Efforts in Eastern Europe could all be undermined by the Nord Stream 2 project. This is not an economic project, it's a political project. The European Union doesn't need Nord Stream 2. It brings with it a heightened risk of instability in Eastern Europe and gives Russia a great deal of influence on European economics and policy. So we have to look at the reality of the global economy. Machine learning, the 4.0 industrial revolution, innovation, all of these things can drive our economy forward. The internal combustion engine has played a great role in industrialization in the West. That Europe built up Airbus, which together with Boeing is the big global aviation player. Now we need to do the same sort of thing in technology. Poland would like to take part in this sort of project. A vehicle for reindustrialization in the 21st century could be electromobility. This is a project that's moving forward but needs more support from member states. Only 1.5% of cars in Europe at the moment are electric cars. If we really want to bring emissions down, then we're going to have to make bigger steps forward. It's not science fiction to say that in 10 years, 25% or 30% of cars could be electric cars in the EU. If we want the technologies of the future to develop, then we have to continue developing the European capital market, particularly for SMEs. Poland supports that development on the market. Growth can also be achieved through intelligent development of the EU economy and an adaptation of the EU project. Now, I said that the second point was European security. The second part of this contract with citizens has to be security. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of geopolitical threats, terrorism, the Russian hybrid war in Ukraine and elsewhere, interference in the democratic process of countries of the West, and events like what we saw in Salisbury or Russia's involvement in Syria. What Russia has done in the Ukraine threatens the architecture of Eastern Europe, but it's aimed at destabilizing the West. Georgia was subject to a similar attack a few years ago, and that shows clearly that what Russia's doing is not coincidence but part of a long-term strategy. The only fault, inverted commas, for these countries was to choose a European economic and political model, and that shows that the European Eastern Partnership is something that the whole EU needs to get behind, because it's essential for our safety, including that of our southern countries. We want peace and development on the borders of the EU as well, and Europe has to react with all the means at its disposal to these developments. We also want to develop our defence capacity. The amount of money that goes towards budget spending, to defence spending and NATO needs to be increased. This is a relationship that has to be cultivated. The power of the West will always be its unity. We should deal with our disagreements in the spirit of partnership. After all, it was America that helped in the First and Second World War and stopped the Soviet Union from attacking Western Europe. The global imbalances that the Americans are talking about are a fact, and they have to be dealt with at global level. I'm therefore happy to see that the European Defence Fund is being set up, and the whole PESC setup, which is going to be a supranational way of investing in the defence sector. This will help us collaborate more closely and develop defence technology. Cybersecurity is another challenge in this area. We know that it's absolutely crucial for democracies, which can be attacked through cybercrime during elections. No EU country is safe from external interference, and our citizens aren't safe from that interference either. Bank accounts and their whole digital identity is under threat from attack. We have to fight together for safety in the cyberspace. The Council summit last week, ladies and gentlemen, has shown that the EU can be realistic and can rebuild citizens' trust. Citizens who want safe borders, and who want the right to influence migration policy. The EU is dealing with a flow of migrants from different directions, and it's only a flexible and intelligent approach to the migratory flows that we're going to be able to rebuild citizens' trust in the EU. Poland is the new home for 1.5 million Ukrainians, many of whom have escaped from Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. They may not be registered in Poland as refugees, but that's simply because administratively it's very easy for them to get work permits and build their lives through supporting our and the EU's economies through work. Migration from the Middle East and Africa is going to increase, and that's why the EU must react, creating stabilization and development in those regions. We need a new Marshall Plan for Europe, for Africa, and we need also to combat illegal human trafficking towards Europe. The EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa is one instrument, but we would propose more, a European Development Fund for Africa. Poland would like to give the fishing rod rather than the fish to Africa, and we would be happy to contribute in a disproportionately high amount as compared to our GDP. This is not just a declaration, but we're also involved in the European Resilience Initiative. The European Union is the greatest success of Europe since the Second World War. Now we have to look again at renewing the EU contract with its citizens to guarantee security and prosperity. So let me say something about the third point I raised earlier, namely a socially just European Union for citizens. We can't forget one fundamental principle that our community is based on: social justice. That principle is the overriding principle of our society, and it can be found in the EU Treaty and the Polish Constitution. These are not just hollow words. You can't talk about social development unless you deal with exclusion, poverty, and inequality. It's important that we have ambitious social policy to fight these inequalities. What we've achieved in the last 2.5 years in Poland shows that if you change the paradigm, you can change the paradigm, and that our strategy has brought excellent effects. We have unemployment under 4% according to Eurostat. Public debt has fallen for the first time in 30 years. The budget deficit is shrinking, and at the same time we have the most ambitious social policy since the fall of communism and the victory of solidarity. We're also cutting red tape for SMEs and citizens. We're reducing taxes, but only for small and medium-sized companies, not for big corporations. We're also creating a sound financial policy by tackling the mafia, tax fraudsters, and by closing loopholes in the tax system. We've also created the biggest support system for technology and information in Eastern Europe. Populist capitalism means innovation and solidarity. The liberalization of trade has created economic growth, and it can't be condemned out of hand. However, economic growth hasn't been to the benefit of everybody to the same degree. I'm not talking about protectionism. The way to deal with inequality is to invest in human capital. Education determines people's future earnings. We must invest in human capital, and that ties to the second challenge that we are linked to: automation and robotization. I'm not going to suggest that we have people working in all posts in the 21st century or block innovation. However, there is a fear that people will be made unemployed by robots, and we have to address that fear. Technological progress will create a demand for new professions, but they will be a different type of job than those in the past. They will require, for example, a high level of skills, and that requires a high level of education. Robotization will mean that capital will be more important in creating jobs and businesses. And we must make sure that capital is distributed fairly, as would be the revenue from that business. Thomas Piketty has shown that capital is very concentrated, and that concentration will continue to intensify. Digitization has led to a winner-takes-all distribution of wealth. Fewer people are taking more of the profit. The digital age, the platform economy, create an opportunity for monopolists. The network effect has led to global giants who don't have any competition. We must combat inequality in the EU, and that's really one of the big arguments that we can put in the current debate on the EU budget. We need new policies for these new challenges, but their funding shouldn't be done at the expense of cohesion and social policy, which is fundamental to the EU and to the treaty provisions. The example of Poland in the last 2.5 years have shown that if you take the right strategy, you can change both society and the economy. The European Union can be a symbol of European dreams once again. But this is only going to be possible if we make the right choice, and if we can overcome our divisions, and if we can remember that despite our divisions we are joined by European identity. In the European Parliament we've heard about European sovereignty. Yes, Europe should be an entity on the global stage, defending its interests. It should be powerful so as to better defend our interests. However, European sovereignty cannot mean building up Europe at the expense of the force of member states, because the force of a sovereign Europe comes from the force of its member states. Weak member states and countries who feel they're being ignored would be a recipe for indifference to the EU, in which the EU is a problem and not a solution. Poland will do its utmost to make sure that that scenario doesn't happen. The EU is an important way of building solidarity, prosperity and security for us. John Paul II said that at the root of a united Europe there were two lungs, an eastern lung and a western lung, and that they were both important for the old continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Union is an open book, and we all have at least one page to write in that book. It's not a finished piece of work. Walter Hallstein, the first director of the Commission, said in 1963 in a speech called Europe Under Construction, said that Europe is a living organism that is continued developing. And with that in mind, we shouldn't engage in determinism that says there's only one future for the EU and forcing us to transfer competences from national level to EU level until we end up with some sort of super state. The EU is an international experiment looking for solutions that weren't available to nation states. Discussion, cooperation, negotiation, this is the DNA of the European project. On the basis of those rules, we have the foundations that were laid by de Gasperi, Adenauer, Schuman and Jean Monnet, the founding fathers. We shouldn't try to gene splice the nature of the EU, therefore, but rather look for new ways to work together to guarantee security and development for our countries and prosperity for our societies. Integration was never a goal in itself for the EU. It was simply to guarantee peace, prosperity, development, democracy and justice. The European community is now at a junction where it has to listen to what its citizens are saying to it. Wrapping up, let me conclude by saying we have to listen to citizens' concern. We have to hear the hope that they still hold out for the EU. We need to guarantee them security, development, solidarity, and peace. Europe has to be open to citizens, giving everyone an equal chance and showing solidarity to the vulnerable. A united Europe in the face of threats which respects the will of nation states. The European Parliament is the best institution to have the citizens' voice heard and understood for the good of free nation states and for the good of the future of the EU. Thank you.